Hello, I'm Keith with the Trombone Shop at Schmidt Music, and today I want to talk a little bit about an interesting idea in trombone design, an idea that goes back a ways, and for folks who have not experienced it before, it's frankly a little strange, a little weird, but I think it's a really sound concept, specifically the idea of tuning in slide. So, again, this is a concept when we have these instruments in the shop and people come to experience them the first time, it's kind of a weird idea, but it goes back quite a ways in the history development of the trombone, which I find interesting in and of itself. And I think it brings some really interesting concepts to the table. So the idea of this really comes back to the idea of conical versus cylindrical instruments. And notice I didn't just say brass instruments because this is an idea that other instrument categories, in the wind family, right? So for example, in our woodwinds, they think about this as well. This is the idea of what happens to the tubing within, an instrument, a wind instrument, as it's moving through the length of the instrument. In other words, does it stay more or less the same size, more cylindrical, or does it expand throughout the length of the instrument, in other words, conical? And where this comes up is it creates a very different sound and response profile. So the most common examples we can think of this in the brass world are trumpet versus cornet, or baritone versus euphonium, right? We have our trumpet, we have our baritone, which are cylindrical instruments, where that tubing size is staying more or less the same. Of course, there can be subtle variations within that, but that's the basic concept, right? And then we have our euphonium, we have our cornet, which are conical instruments. In other words, from the very beginning, all the way through, the tubing is getting larger and larger. And what happens is that we find these cylindrical instruments tend to have a brighter overall timbre profile. They tend to be more focused. They tend to accentuate more of the mid, upper, overtones and frequencies. They tend to have more projection, and they tend to have a little bit quicker response, a little bit more front to the sound versus our conical instruments, the euphonium, the cornet, flugelhorn, for example, tuba, which tend to have a much broader sound in general, tends to accentuate more of the mid and lower overtones in the timbre, the frequency distribution tends to have, to me, a little bit softer outside to the sound. The sound tends to go outward a little bit more versus the cylindrical instruments, where it goes kind of forward a little bit more, right? And we've heard this. This is why, if you've experienced why cornet versus trumpet. If you hear the two instruments side by side, especially if the instruments are approached as being different instruments using different kinds of airflow, etc., very different sound concepts. Now, we know that the trombone is generally considered to be a cylindrical instrument, but there is an argument, from certain makers, certain design concepts, that if we can make the trombone more conical, it's going to, maybe not improve the sound response profile, but it's going to change it, right? Give us a different experience within all of this. Now, the trombone, of course, has some interesting challenges as compared to a lot of the other instrument categories, in that there are a lot of areas within the instrument that have to remain cylindrical, right? The hand slide, right? The hand slide has to be cylindrical. It has to be parallel. You can't have the tubing expanding through the hand slide because it won't move anywhere, right? We have to have all the tubes parallel. Similarly, with our standard tuning slide, when we have our tuning slide typically up here, the legs of the tuning slide have to be parallel. They have to be cylindrical as well in order to allow the tuning slide to move. And as a side note, this is where the idea, if we've talked about things like dual bore hand slides, where the first leg of the hand slide is a little smaller, the second leg of the hand slide is a little bit bigger, that's one way for us to create a little bit of this conical type of profile, this expanding tubing profile, right? But the long and short of it is that there are a lot of points in the instruments that just cannot be conical. So going back, at least into the early 1900s, doing some research, the earliest examples I'm aware of that I've been able to find have been from, around the very early 1900s, 1910 thereabouts, where we makers started looking at this and said, well, what if we take the areas of the instrument that have to be cylindrical and we combine them together? So in other words, we're taking the tuning slide and the hand slide, combining them together and putting it all in one. And so what that allows us to do is to take the entire bell section, whether we're talking about our straight tenor like this, where it from the hand side receiver all the way through the neck pipe, all the way through here, it can be conical, or in the case of an instrument with the F attachment here, like this greenhoe, from coming out of the valve section, the entire rest of the bell section can be conical. So again, the idea is it's going to change the sound, change the response. So it's an idea, again, that's been around for a while, and there are different ways of kind of accomplishing this whole idea with the tuning and slide. So the big challenge with this is that we have to have a way to be able to keep the tuning slide portion in place. So, for example, we can take a look here at this greenhoe, and so we've got this mechanism right here. And so with this, what they've done is they basically have this captive nut here, and so to adjust the tuning slide, you're going through and just adjusting this nut, thumb screw if you want to say that, and it's moving the tuning slide, right? Or we can have, this is a common setup I've seen with a number of different makers. S.E. Shires has a similar kind of setup that they've used on their one of their custom alto trombones. Or the other design that we've seen quite a bit is this type of setup where we have these two different nuts on either side of the tuning slide, and then you go through and you loosen it up, and it allows us to move the tuning slide backward and forward, and then we can go through and tighten it back down again here. So that's the concept of the tuning and slide. There are some potential benefits. There are some potential drawbacks with that. We'll talk about that. I thought I would demonstrate a little bit what the differences are with the tuning and slide versus not. I happen to have two of the same greenhoe model, the GC4, one with tuning and slide, one without. So I'm going to take a quick play so you can hear both of those side by side and maybe get a little bit of idea of what are the differences with this tuning and slide concept. As you may have heard, there really is a difference in the experience of the tuning and slide versus the standard, tuning slide in bell, setup. For me as a player, I tend to find the tuning and slide, kind of like I described, it tends to be a darker, warmer sound. It feels more open, which again, makes a lot of sense. There's a depth of sound to the sound that I really, really like. But I think where we find for a lot of players, the tuning and slide can feel a little bit too broad and open. I tend to find that it works really well for folks who have, frankly, a little bit more of a conical type of airflow. Now, what does that mean? For me, that means slowing down the airflow, thinking broader, warmer with the airflow. A lot of times I describe our lower register as feeling like that. Having more, it's supported sound, but it's a little bit slower, it's warmer, it's more spread versus a more typical tenor trombone type of setup where I'm thinking a little bit more compact, a little bit more, a little bit more compression, a little bit more directional. For a lot of folks, again, even very experienced folks who have big, dark sounds, this type of setup, the tuning and slide setup, tends to be almost a little bit too broad in that. I actually find it works really well a lot of times for folks who are euphonium or tuba players, for example. Folks who are used to this air concept, there can be a real comfort level with all of this. With the small bore tenors, it is a little bit different, and I think the same thing with the alto trombone. Just because we're dealing with a smaller tubing size, I don't see as much of a clear difference where people have a very strong preference or dislike for the overall experience of it. It more is about, just like with a lot of other things with the instrument, it's about changing the airflow concept and kind of tweaking all of it. But again, it's a very different experience. Now, as we may have noticed, there aren't a whole lot of these around. Obviously, this is not a design concept that has really, really caught on and taken hold within the larger majority of trombone players. Why is that? Well, there are, I think, a few different things. First off, it is depending how we make it, it can be a finicky kind of setup with all of it. Whether we're talking a setup like this or even something like this, there's just extra hardware that we have to be using with this. And overall, by adding this, the extra tubing for the tuning slide setup inside of the hand slide, etc., we're adding weight to the slide. And so one of the things for feedback that we get quite a bit with these instruments, and I think a lot of people experience, is that the hand slides are going to be heavier. They're a little bit more unwieldy. Versus our standard, yellow brass tuning slides, let alone lightweight hand slide setups. And while occasionally I will get feedback from folks saying that, oh, this hand slide feels like way too light, it doesn't happen a whole lot, right? And so I think for a lot of folks, just the concept of it, the weight of it, the action of the hand slide is just kind of unwieldy within all of that. Another factor to consider within that is it tends to be more expensive. There is obviously a completely different process we have to go through in building the hand slide. It's more complicated, and so it tends to be more expensive. For example, with the Greenhill, the GC4, or like the bass trombone they're offering, the GC5 they're offering with the tuning slide, it adds a significant amount to the price of the instrument. And then we come down to the playing concept as well. I think, again, for a lot of folks, it's a concept that just feels really different, not necessarily antithetical to how we play, but it's just a very different concept. And so I think the overall idea fits in with a smaller percentage of players. With that being said, it's certainly been used, so we've got the Con GC4, the Greenhill, design line has used this. Olds, so we've got an Olds, 1921 Olds M, model here. They were using this. There are examples, again, of Con going back to around 1910, where we've seen this in place. And other more modern makers as well. We know Canstel did some work with this. S.E. Shires offers this on one of their custom alto trombone models. M&W is doing some work that they will build you a custom tuning and slide, hand slide. BAC in Kansas City has offered this in the past, among others. So it's an option. People are out there, they're willing to do it. It's just not a huge part of our community, of our world right now. But I think it's a really, really interesting concept within all of this. So I'm just really glad to have been able to share some of this with you. If you've had a chance to experience the whole tuning and slide idea, love to have your feedback, your experience with it, or if you have other questions about what we talked about with this here, more particulars about these instruments, other design concepts within all of that, or anything else, please feel free to leave them in the comments. If you like the video, consider giving it a thumbs up. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, please think about doing that. We'd love to have you as a part of our community. And of course, you can find the Trombone Shop on Facebook and Instagram. As always, thanks for watching.